I want to build my family a garden room using salvaged materials for under £500. For over 6 months now, I've been on a mission to find free and low-cost building materials with this build in mind. You won't believe some of the incredible finds I've managed to get my hands on. I want to show how you can achieve some amazing things on a tiny budget with some creative thinking. In the previous episode, I installed EPDM rubber to the roof and membrane to the walls, and in this one, I'll be finishing the outside of the structure.
So time to install some windows and doors. This window was free on Marketplace. I just needed to make an alteration to the sill to get it to fit around my batten. I installed the glazed unit on top of a couple of packers, and then I can fit the internal beads, which went in nice and easy for once. I had a few of these soffit vents left over from when I built my brother's shed last year, and I'm going to install 2 of these, one above each window, after cutting away some of the membrane to allow air to flow through. I also managed to pick up a set of French doors and a large matching window, also from Marketplace. I'll talk about the costs later in the video.
I didn't get a sill with this door, and to be honest, I didn't think I would need one with this roof overhang, but now I can see it built. I can see driving rain hitting the glass and running to the bottom of the doors. At the bottom of the door frame are 2 weep holes, although this one's full of mud at the moment, and these are designed so that any water that makes it beyond the glazed panel can drain out onto a sill. But because I don't have a sill, I need to find a solution so that water can drain away from the building without coming into contact with any timber.
So using my Shinto rasp, I cut 2 channels which will allow water to drain away. And I have this piece of plastic trunking which I'll use to make 2 small drainage outlets. I thought this was a clever solution, but later you'll see just how unclever I really am. As a second line of defence, I'll also coat everything with some bitumen paint. And while I was at it, I painted the top of the joists where the decking will be added later too. While waiting for that to dry, I got the door frame installed with some packers all around it, making sure it was level and plumb. I thought I was going to need a second pair of hands for hanging the doors, but with the aid of a brick and a toolbox, I managed to hang them on my own, which was a bonus. I then get the hinges adjusted so that they open and close nicely. And I added some lubricant because these poor doors have been sitting in my garden neglected for about 6 months. These came from a building site, so they needed a good clean up. Right, so now I'm looking at installing these drainage channels, but before I do that I thought, why not just pour some water in to test that they were in the right place? And that's when this happened. So it seems the outlet hole on the bottom is in a different place to the inlet. So it's multi-tool to the rescue again as I create 2 new channels, this time in the right place. After painting again and waiting for it to dry, I can finally get these installed with some silicone. But do they actually work? Yes, they work great. The final window is gigantic, and even if I deglazed it, I think I would have struggled to lift it in on my own, so I asked a friend to give me a hand, and while waiting for him to arrive, I could get that other vent fitted. Now for part 2 of me not being very clever. The first time we lifted it in, I couldn't work out why there was a big gap at the top. That's when I realised I'd forgotten to add the sill. So I quickly applied some silicone to the top of the sill, and then slipped it in while we lifted the window in a second time. Thanks for your help, Lee, if you're watching. After a final bit of windowsill surgery, that's all the windows and doors in. Now, back to Keith from the past to talk about cladding.
To make the cladding, I'm going to be using some of these pine boards which were ripped off someone's roof, and these boards which came off somebody else's roof. They do have the remnants of some old roof felt on one side, while the other side is pretty clean, but this isn't going to matter for reasons which will become clear very soon.
I had already spent some time denailing these boards, as well as repairing splits, and cutting clean ends. And next I wanted to cut some rebates so that each piece of cladding can overlap the next. The boards that are available to buy, like tongue and groove and shiplap, have a much smaller overlap, which can cause a lot of problems when the timber expands and contracts with seasonal changes. And I've already had a bad experience with it once before, despite me making allowances for the wood that I was using back then being very wet. I'll cut the rebates at the table saw, so I'm setting the blade height to 20mm and positioning the blade to cut on one side of my centre mark. Then I can flip the board over 180 degrees and repeat. And once that's done to each board, I set the blade height and fence to cut away the waste. A minor bit of chiselling was needed just to clean these up. By making my own cladding, not only will I end up with a much more appropriate size of overlap to deal with the British weather, but this timber is also better quality than what is used in the cladding that I've bought before. You can see here the tight growth rings. This is good quality redwood. This was obviously quite a lot of work, but I think it'll be worth it. And charring the boards is going to help protect them from moisture, UV damage and insects. And in my opinion, it makes them look cool too. One thing I struggled with a bit was the boards catching fire, particularly in the areas where there were some old nail holes, so I kept some water on hand. I completely destroyed this board unfortunately, but later you'll see that it gets used anyway. I worked out that this should be enough to do the entire building, and now several months later, it's time to find out. I'm pre-drilling the ends of the boards to avoid splitting. I'm also leaving an expansion gap between each board of around 3 to 4mm. And the reasons for using decking screws rather than nails for this are firstly because I was worried about splitting these boards, especially after having spent so much time milling them up. And secondly, if I ever have to replace any of these boards for any reason, it will be very easy to do. Of course though, it would have been much quicker using a nailer. I can use some of this black silicone to fill any old nail holes.
I want to add a corner post here which will cover the end grain and the batten. So that's 40mm, and if I can find a 40mm square piece, that will cover the end grain of the boards that go on the front too.
But I couldn't.
I'm going to have to laminate a couple of battens together to get me the thickness I need.
I'm making a mark so that I can line up my bottom piece of cladding on this back wall with the cladding on the first wall. And on that first wall, I had used most of the longer lengths and better looking pieces of cladding because it's the wall that will be visible from our house. The two walls at the back though, I'm much less bothered about. So here I can use up some of the shorter lengths, butting them together over a batten. Sealing up any gaps with silicone just to try and keep things on the outside mostly airtight. This area at the front required some more thought, as I'll need some sort of sill to close the gap at the top. More on that later. And with this ruined piece of cladding from earlier, I'll rip away the bad material and use this to trim around the windows.
unfortunately, I've now run out of cladding. So I'm going to see what other pine boards I've got in the workshop that I might be able to use.
I found a few really nice clean boards, so I milled them up and charred them in the same way, and it seemed a bit ironic to be using these on the back wall, but I guess at least it'll be nicer for our neighbours to look at. This video's turning into a bit of a longer one, and I hope you're still awake. Next, I got all the windows and doors sealed up with some builder's silicone.
So that leaves me with just this area above the doors and window to clad. And I think I'm going to use some salvaged plywood for this. This isn't marine grade ply or anything like that, but because of the roof overhang and the fact that I can seal this up pretty good with the bitumen paint, I think it'll be fine. If not, I can always replace it in a few years. Right, it's finally time to get some decking at the front here, and the first thing I'm going to do is add a board at the front. I think when I put these bearers down I did a pretty good job at keeping this front edge straight, but we will find out now.
First though, they're going to need a really good scrub. This bleachy warm water did a great job, as you can see in this footage here. Once dry, the first board can be ripped down to form a front fascia. And then the next board needs to be cut to fit around the door opening. I want to leave a gap of around 10mm between each board so that the rain can pass through. And because some of these boards were quite warped, I cut a wedge with the circular saw so that I could force them straight before fastening.
I've been thinking about what to do in this area here to make sure that water sheds away from the building. And viewers of my junk hunt series may remember when I found this piece of acrylic by some bins.
So I'm going to attempt to scribe fit a piece right up to the glass here. And I'll bed this down on some silicone and then seal around. I think these turned out pretty nice. Before I add some finishing touches and look at the costs, I just wanted to let you know that I have plans and a full detailed materials and cutting list for this project, and they've been specially developed and optimised for off-the-shelf timber sizes and materials, so you don't have to go to all of the trouble that I did, salvaging, denailing and all of that stuff. Unless you want to, of course. And they are designed to be flexible too, so you can use whatever window or door sizes you choose. I'll leave a link in the description box below.
I'm going to see if I've got anything in my wood finishes cupboard that I can use to protect both the deck and hopefully the cladding too. I've got some boiled linseed oil, that's a good start.
I decided to thin this by doing a 50-50 mix with some white spirit, which should help it better penetrate the wood. And after using a stiff brush to remove any excess charring on the cladding, I applied the same mix there too, topped up with any oils I could find in my cupboard.
So that's the outside of the garden room complete. Let's see how we did against the £500 budget. In the previous episodes, I spent a total of £342. In this one, I spent £100 on the French doors and the large window. The other window was free. All of those were from Marketplace, by the way. £14 for decking screws, £11 for silicone, and unfortunately I ran out of bituminous paint on this one, so I had to buy another tin costing £22. That means the total spent was £489, which leaves me with £11, and as the sun is shining and it's a Friday, I'm off to the pub to buy myself a beer. Of course, there is still a lot to be done here on the inside, and once again I plan to do as much as possible using salvaged materials. I'm going to be taking a break from this project though, because there are a couple of other videos that I want to make, but please do stay tuned to the channel, and thanks for watching.